ये अभी वो लोगों को डाल दूंगा इसमें लोगों
This image is blurred. Yeah, now it's better.
Hi, Akhila ji.
Yeah. Sorry, it was a little bit of flickering was happening. Yeah. Put on the camera. I think it'll come on its own.
Akhila ji, take your time. We are still.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Akhila ji.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for
Yeah.
calling me, and good to see you too.
So I think people will take us. We'll wait for another 2 to 3 minutes for people to join
absolutely.
in.
Yeah.
And then we'll start.
Good evening, ma'am.
Hi, good evening, Gopeshi.
Good evening, ma'am.
Hi, good evening. Good evening, Vikram. So we have around 36 people, and I think we have a good number, Akhilaji. What do you say?
Whatever,
Yes.
entirely your call.
We are expecting more people to join in. As I told you, the project managers and the staff from the state offices, they are the ones who are connected. And then we also have our VPs and senior project managers and AVPs from the headquarter. So hello and good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
So thank you so much for joining in for the Learning Day today, which is scheduled on the theme Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment, Pathways for Gender Transformation. It is our privilege that we have with us Akhila Sivadas today, who is the Managing Trustee and Executive Director of Center for Advocacy and Research, famously known as CFAR. Ms. Sivadas, as a founder member, brings with her over 4 decades of experience as a development professional, researcher, communication and advocacy expert. Over the last 26 years, she has been focused on securing engagement of all stakeholders, including media, to advance the inclusion and mainstreaming of women and other marginalized groups across sectors such as health, social security, livelihood, and WASH, and to also make all forms of communication informed and gender sensitive. Akhila ji is a prolific writer, and she has contributed to mainstreaming gender and intersectionalities in strategy documents and various policy briefs, both nationally and globally. So without further ado, it is my privilege once again to welcome Akhila Sivadas to take over for this session. Akhila ji has a presentation, which I believe she will take us through the presentation and would talk about the theme in detail. I request you all to pay attention, and we will be happy to open the floor for discussion and questions. In case anyone wants to type out questions, please feel free to also use the chat window. For doing so, we look forward to your full participation and hopefully we will have a very engaging session today. Over to you, Akhila ji. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Meenakshi, first for calling me and for such a detailed, introduction. I'm not quite clear about the audience, but from what I can see, they're part of your program staff. Is that correct? Part of Access Development?
Yes. So Akhila ji, yes. So Akhila ji, we have around our 11 state offices from where different project leads and project managers have joined in. As I told you, we operate from our headquarters is based out of Delhi, and it is in Hauz Khas village. Access is actually, it's a livelihood support organization for sustainable livelihoods of people living in poverty. And 60 to 70% of our portfolio, women happen to be a very integral part of our portfolio. We work in farm, non-farm, and financial inclusion space. And we follow a three-tier strategy where the tier one is basically on-ground implementation of projects, and tier two is about capacity building of capacity builders. And we also engage with multilateral and bilateral organizations. We work very closely with other civil society organizations and partners. And at tier three is more of ecosystem support, policy support, advocacy. And in that capacity, you must have heard of these two flagship summits that we do every year. One is Inclusive Finance Summit, which has gone global now. It just completed its 20th year of functioning, and the Livelihoods India Summit has completed its 13 years. So, and then at the ecosystem level, we also have a GATE-supported program, which is about Udyam Mahila, where we are trying to build pathways for growth of women's enterprise through, setting up, looking at the possibility of setting up a national task force for advancing women enterprise. We're also looking at setting up a civil society collaborative or a forum for taking up issues of women entrepreneurs in a much deeper way, and looking at the possibility of coming up with an enterprise index. And in that capacity, we are also engaging with multiple players in the ecosystem at the policy level through policy convenings and bringing out knowledge products. So I think this much is good enough for you to kind of get a sense of who all are part of this conversation. And thank you so much once again. And over to you now. Thank you.
I would like to actually, to begin with, just, maybe throw open the session to the floor, so to speak. If there is somebody, if there are a couple of people who would like to just pose their own quandaries or dilemmas or challenges, I'd be happy to listen to that, so that we start from a problem statement or from some, whatever, our understanding, and then we build into the presentation. So if there's anybody who would like to just speak up and let me know, despite all the sort of wealth of experience, we are still, all of us are, grappling with the sort of set of new challenges that are in front of the development sector. So any set of, questions or quandaries that people have, if that can be posed, just to get the conversation going and for me to anchor my presentation.
So is there anybody who wants to kind of come in
at top of the mind
stage?
Thought.
Hi, ma'am. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening.
So my name is Anchal. I deal with a program called Living Looms of India in Access, and mostly we work with handloom weavers, artisans. So thank you. This is a very interesting topic, and it's not only topic, but I think it's time to act upon all these on these topics. So when it comes to gender, for me, it seems that it is an unfinished agenda, at least in next 50, 60 years, whatever the data suggests. And I come from a rural area, like I studied in rural area, then I came to Varanasi, then Mumbai, and then working in rural areas and urban areas also. I see a huge gap even within the women, and again I'm making this statement that this is the part of a larger ecosystem. It is not only about female or no. So and lots of research, lots of studies are also happening on the issues of gender, around the issues of gender. So, I mean, what is the way forward then? No, we can accelerate the progress actually, because for me it seems an unfinished agenda on the pace that we are going on, working on. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Really a important question and a quandary, even for the best of the, so-called gender experts. It continues to sort of, shall we say, tax and challenge people, what you're asking. Any other? One more, and then I get to my deep diving.
So, Akhila, if I may be allowed, I would want to sort of, make a point, which is about there's so much of discourse happening around women-led development now at the highest level
Correct.
of, and there is a lot of political commitment being shown. The challenge looks mammoth because of the fact that while there is so much of noise being built around women-led development, we know that we are still miles away from,
Very true.
meeting the agenda 2030, which we had set out for ourselves. And so, I mean, in terms of the challenge, while the challenge is mammoth, how do we translate this larger vision into a workable reality? And how do we bring gender equality closer to the women's economic empowerment and the entire entrepreneurship discourse, so that we are able to kind of, make greater gains in terms of their actual participation in the economy?
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's a good start. Is there anyone else voluntary? Okay. If not, then I get started. So I want to preface the entire presentation by saying that, much of what we are doing, a lot of what we are doing, let's start with the assumption that we are chipping a big rock. There's a big rock in front of us, and we are chipping. No, in no way, whatever we are doing is not going to make a difference. And yet, we are constantly, as Anchal was saying, we are constantly confronted by, what we call the gender gap. And the gender sort of, shall we say, the social marginalization that women and other communities, all the intersectionalities of women, face. So while we are, at our jobs at different levels, and as practitioners, we tend to, use what is called a snowballing methodology. We go to the community, we perceive something, we actually even gather data and evidence, and then, start responding because there is a sense of urgency. You can use, Meenakshi says, there's so much conversation and so much noise. And this is not peculiar to the times that we are in now. It has been there since 95, since the Beijing Platform of Action. There's been this constant realization or this constant sort of, shall we say, sort of thought that has been part of all kinds of, development planning, that, gender has to be cross-cutting, gender has to be integral, gender mainstreaming is your main sort of, crucible on which you build the progress of the, what we call the development progress. So it's not as though all this noise and terminology and, conversation is new. And yet there are challenges. And that is one of the reasons why around, let's say a decade ago, we realized that, this entire business of gender, if we are looking at it as a cross-cutting issue, as something that is salient, essential, fundamental, basic, which is what my first, slide talks about. And I've deliberately used this slide because it's as part of the noise. And this noise is not new, that all of this has been accepted. It's not like we are fighting the principle or we are fighting the precept, or we are fighting what is called the basic, conceptual framework. Gender is very, very integral to everything. And in fact, as we are getting deeper and deeper into the whole development, right from MDG to SDG, this has become even more critical and even more like a defining, shall we say, a defining concept. Gender equality and equity, social equity and gender equality are integral. We can see that even as you go back into in fact, one of the things that you should read is the Beijing Platform of Action. Very critically, it, highlighted 12 sort of, very critical areas where women had to be ensconced. The whole issue of women's development had to be ensconced. It went from everything from poverty, education, health, violence, economy, just about every area, media, just about every area, the Beijing Platform of Action touched upon. Armed conflict, you can take any area. There were about 12 major areas, and they've, looked at each of those areas and tried to locate where women's development had to take place, where women had to be ensconced, decision-making, institutional mechanism, human rights, and environment. Just about 12 major areas they took, 12 major thematic areas they took, and they created what is called a continuum between that thematic area and all that we know about the thematic area and where women are. And till date, that, Platform of Action is very, very powerful. It continues to influence all our sort of, understanding of women and their role and their sort of, positioning in the entire human progress. So if we now accept that, all of this has been put down, and in principle, in precept, in concept, in a tenet, there is no dispute across the world that gender equality is critical, then we go into what is called a problem statement. And then you're getting into exactly what Aanchal and Meenakshi said. You're getting into very sort of, high, shall we say, laudable ideas at one level, great sort of, importance given to the whole issue of gender equality at one level. At another level, when you actually, sort of unlock or unravel that statement, you're finding, this is a typical thing which, which haunts you, which I picked up from the ADBI, website, and I was part of this entire consultation and seminar. I also contributed to one of the sort of sessions on this entire thing, the conceptual framework, and it holds true. So what are you seeing? You're seeing yourself traversing a journey. At one end is your journey of challenges to your so-called recommendations for change. You're traversing that entire journey, and you realize that the challenges are multiple. They're systemic, they're structural, they are, at multiple levels, from what they call as low skilled to preponderant, burden of care, to inequality in terms of ownership, land ownership, property, digital access, education, just about anything you pick, and women are lagging behind. They are literally, in terms of the progress of the rest, they are sort of, somewhere far below the overall progress that is happening. And clearly, despite this acceptance of concept, precept, principle, all of that, we know that, the time has now come to move into what we call not only gender intentional, but also what we call gender transformative. And that's a big challenge for practitioners. It looks simple on paper, but it's not easy to delve into practice, because there is a whole continuum that you have to keep tracking in every action you do. You have to track whether they have moved in that continuum from being unaware, being exploited, being brutalized, being subordinated to transformative. And there is a whole set of transactions that informs every sort of, part of that value chain from being unaware to being transformative. And obviously the push has to come from what we call a policy framework. And in fact, it has to be highly sort of, shall we say, affirmative. And it has to tilt the balance in favor of women. It has to be a women-led development now. It has to, at the cost of, larger sort of, problems, issues, it has to make a conscious choice, a policy choice of, now reducing that gap, reducing the gender disparity, and actually now working towards a transformative process. So, and as practitioners, we are caught in this process. We are then every day accountable to what we are doing. And are we moving the, shall we say, like in a chessboard, you move the pawns and the instruments, are we moving it ahead is what we need to see. Here they're clearly listed, their set of what they call policy commitments, from skilling, recruitment to, a lot of care infrastructure to, access to healthcare, social protection, safety, to redefining the professional role of women. So, and of course, and to, combat what are called age-old social norms, all the cultural and social norms that we are, bogged down by or weighed down by. So this is the kind of, what we call a 360-degree change that we are envisaging and that we are talking about. Now the question arises, it's easy to diagnose a problem. It is even at some level, not easy, but somewhat, shall we say, logical to, make certain recommendations, whether it's about recommendations on mindset or recommendations at a policy level to measure women's work participation, do something about the care economy, to do something on skilling, and to build women's enterprise. Now, all of this at a conceptual level is critical. Why? Because, a problem statement, the first is to get a consensus on the problem statement. A women-led development, is we are talking about, needs a very, very uncompromising problem statement. So from that standpoint, this is an important departure. And when we went into this entire deliberation around this problem statement, we really sort of, shall we say, unraveled the layers and layers of, concerns and issues. I was a part of this seminar, talked about access to water, sanitation, and hygiene. It is such a determining factor when it comes to, not only gender equality, and not only livelihood, but the larger issue of gender equality. So from a problem statement point of view, this becomes a critical sort of, way of, or a lens to, apply. Now the question arises is, in our work, how do we ensure we're all involved in livelihood? Your access development particularly is involved in the whole, issue of strengthening access to livelihood. All of you are working on the field. So then the question that arises is, how do we sort of ensure that the everyday work that we are doing, and all of that is very critical, whether at the level of right to work, whether at the level of financial inclusion, whether at the level of, enterprise, whether at the level of skilling, every one of them is critical. It's not like any of them, the instrumentalities are very, very critical. They are the means, they are the agencies, they are the ways in which you develop your, journey towards transformative. Despite that, we still need to step back and see whether we are, willing it that way or not. And I deliberately took Kudumbashri. It's a very large-scale livelihood program, very well documented, well written, very sort of intentionally driven over the last 2 decades and more, and continues even till today, continues to be at a crossroad. It's not like they've thrown up answers to all the questions that we have raised, which, whether all of that, what they're doing in the name of livelihood, in the name of financial inclusion, enterprise development, whether it is actually influencing mainstream programs and institutions. Are they being able to converge at the urban level with the urban local bodies and at the rural level with the Panchayati Raj? Is that local self-governance element emerging strongly? Because within that is ensconced what is called the political power of women. And within the political power of women is ensconced the larger or the longer vision of a women's led development. So is there enough sort of, traction between all of this and what the women are, aspiring for? And how much of the current mainstreaming that is happening is actually being influenced? And is there a readiness? Is there an appetite for transformational process? Kerala is one of those places where you typically caught in what is called a gender paradox. At one level, all their indicators, reveal great progress, great breakthroughs, and there is a kind of a sort of almost shall we say, a fairy tale element to their story, the way they have evolved. And at the same time, the cultural norms, the attitude to women, the level of violence against them is all shocking. So now the question arises, can this program get out of that paradox? Can it pave the way for what we call women-led development or a transformative, gender transformative process? When we went to assess that, the first thing we noticed was, as far as the documentation was concerned, and as far as the ground realities were concerned, by their own admission, they were very clear that, the financial inclusion, access to credit, access to livelihood had made a quantum jump. But that did not address issues of caste, gender violence, alienation from assets, property, son preference, all of that persisted. And the data clearly indicated, you can see from the data that as high as, 76% show no improvement in terms of assets. They're not really reached the stage of what we call an economic breakthrough in a large majority of them. And this is a program that has been in existence from 1998. It's not something that has happened overnight. And yet they're struggling to, build this sort of, shall we say, momentum for women-led development. No improvement in incomes, all 59%. Till today, they find, getting a bank loan is a major challenge. And that is something that is across the country, despite all the big, programs that the state governments are running as part of their entire, both livelihood and SHG development. And when it comes to caste and when it comes to SC and ST, the figures were shocking. There's no increase at all in any of it. And the so-called, highly marginalized communities, very low rates of participation. Now, what does this, reveal to you? Clearly what the gender paradox that I spoke about, but more importantly, what does it reveal? It just reveals, as Anshul was saying, that they're not a homogeneous group. Women are not a homogeneous group. Even if you collectivize in large numbers, today they are actually claiming that 1/3, little over 1/3, or even more, are part of what are called the neighborhood groups. And that's true not only for Kerala, but it's also true for other states like Bihar and, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, etc. They're all claiming that this collectivization is very high and women have all come under these neighborhood groups or the self-help groups. And a lot of the sort of, early actions of women's empowerment is happening. And in fact, in some instances, even growing exponentially. And yet, if you scratch beyond the surface, you're finding all the structural caste, poverty, violence, patriarchy at its worst, male domination persisting. So any livelihood program that's not able to break these sort of, deeply entrenched mindsets, norms, behaviors, practices, then, gets into a sort of a self-reflection. And that is what happened to this program. And they responded by synthesizing their actions. They're still doing it. It's not like everything has been, resolved. They're still at it. And there are new challenges on the ground, even as you're, sort of working towards the solutions. And they sort of, worked on what is called simultaneously moving the narrative at the economic, social, and organizational level. And that is interesting to see. And that's because a lot of this has, there are two sets of entities that, determine this program. At one level, there is this entire community network, which is very, which has reached something like a little over 3 lakhs, I think, neighborhood groups, some 20,000 sort of, area development societies, all of that. So there are huge numbers over there that are, participating in this program. This is your entire community, development. On the other side is a strong sort of, mission of Kudumbashree, which has now been absorbed into the state rural livelihood and state urban livelihood mission, and is part of that entire larger program with a distinct advantage, like unlike other states, of having moved the whole narrative, both at the governmental level, particularly at the third tier level, and at the community level. Even despite all of that, there is a whole set of, what we call social engineering that they had to engage in. So when it came to economic empowerment, they were very clear that, particularly after 2004, 2005, they went in a very big way as part of, in fact, the early sort of collectivization and the early sort of, forming the savings groups and starting to, do income generation. All of that greatly helped once, something like Manrega came into the scene and, legislated on the right to work, especially right to rural work. That gave a big fillip to these groups, and they were able to sort of utilize this program, not only to sort of, make that program and that on record. All data now reveals that, this one of the biggest sort of, shall we say, benefit or advantage that this program had was the increase of work, in women's work participation. So that it has played a great role in large parts of the country, but here even more so. And then all of that translated also into enterprise development, particularly collective farming. Many sort of, breakthroughs were made in terms of women and farming. And, you also, by now, the local self-government was in fact ready to even contract these, large sort of federated self-help groups contract them into business partners and make them responsible for a lot of this public service that is being provided. Instead of going to some private operator or getting some kind of a bidder from the market, they actually put in their entire sort of, hope in these formations. And, in terms of just the whole program was giving a lot of importance to economic development, economic empowerment. And this is something that we all, witness when we go to the field. Women, wherever you go to, wherever the poorer families that you visit are all clamoring for work. In fact, no other sort of agenda can move forward till you do something about, or start thinking, or start linking, or start shall we say, catalyzing something in the area of work. So I think economic empowerment in many ways is critical. The early breakthroughs that you make in terms of livelihood is very, very critical. It becomes even critical for raising voice, agency, and strengthening what we call assertion of women, and their assertion of their rights as women workers, and as women development players. But however, they soon realized that the social norms were very, very conservative. They got huge feedback from the community about the rampant violence that they were facing, and the kind of sort of shall we say, male domination and male sort of shall we say, and the kind of levels of discrimination they were experiencing. So it became then a reflective exercise. Why? The question arose, why was women succumbing? After all, they're already collectivized. They have the support of a mission. They have the support of a program. What is stopping them from contesting the kind of, whatever, exploitation and the kind of harassment and discrimination that they were facing? And there was a sense that, that the whole process from being, they were actually had reached part of the spectrum that they had reached was sort of, shall we say, when we transition from aware to accommodating, which means you're a little bit of the old and a little bit of the new. You practice your old, sometimes in your private spaces, you're quite submissive, but in your public spaces, you're, willing to sort of support, women's issues and women's causes. So from that stage of accommodating to the stage when the system is actually becoming responsive, looking for opportunities, opening opportunities, facilitating, development, ensuring that you have proper space to sit, you have proper budgets to work with, you're given a proper sort of, shall we say, positioning within the system. Even while all that was happening, and all of it can be put down, as practitioners, we'll be every day writing how awareness has grown, how in terms of accommodation, there is a recognition of, women's rights and entitlements at one level. There is also a responsiveness and mainstreaming of, women's needs. Even as you're writing down, even as you're recording and documenting and, tracking the progress, you will realize that somewhere, you reach a stage when some change happens, but the change is not strong enough, to tilt the balance. You're still sort of, shall we say, dealing with the challenges and the sort of impediments. So, very often, even in the 50s and 60s, when we were growing up, just post-independence, one of the things that, many of us are first generation learners. Maybe our fathers went to college and, schools and colleges, but a lot of our mothers did not. So, there was always this anomaly that, used to hit us, that at one level, when you entered the, presence of, universities and colleges, you confronted very sort of, progressive, modern, academicians, teachers, very, very sort of, and all women, many who did not get married even, who actually dedicated their lives to building the nation and building the next generation. And then you would come home and your environment would be very different. you will face a sort of what we call a sort of, it will be almost surreal. At college, you will be having one kind of a persona because you're inspired by all these very, ambitious, well sort of educated, well sort of, spoken women, and your own domestic environment, which was very conservative and continues to be shackled by all kinds of, practices and norms. So it was very clear that all of this, was that many of the sort of so-called cultural norms were not shifting. For cultural norms to shift, they realized that women have to become key actors. It's not about just a system. It's not even about getting them together and asserting their power as a collective. They have to be as individuals and as, shall we say, as an interest group, motivated to make the changes, to break the glass ceiling, so to speak. And that is when they went into what is called a self-learning program, based on a set of self-inquiry as to why I'm, accommodating this much, how I'm not able to leverage the responsiveness, how I'm not able to shift the goalpost when I return home. I tend to sort of, become I go back and I regress back into a sort of, almost an unaware person rather than an active player. So they initiated that whole set of self-inquiry, and they developed, resources within the community, educators, facilitators, people who actually took on the challenges in terms of attitudes, mindset, norms, and all of that is very dear to all of us. It's not easy to cast it away. It has to be very sort of, consciously calibrated and, worked against or worked through. And that's what they did. They developed a lot of learning modules. They looked at each dimension of the issue. They went beyond just SHGs. They went beyond just financial inclusion. They looked at governance. They looked at justice. They looked at the whole issue of health. Health was one of the big challenges. And one major challenge the women were facing was substance use and, high degree of, addictions to all kinds of substances. And that entire sort of, the way sort of, shall we say, the way, the economy, their own, shall we say, lifestyles were changing. And most importantly, they decided that they will set up this entire center to address violence. Violence became a major issue. Everything was sort of being pushed back by the degree of violence that they were experiencing. And it's not enough just to run some legal aid. It's not enough just to sort of, know your laws. It's not enough to just sort of, file a couple of cases here and there. You need to have, a strong, within the community, a strong instrumentality, which is not only sort of addressing the violence, but it's also addressing, in a very big way, the prevention. Because once the problem sets in, it's much more difficult to, make the shifts. If you can stop a problem or halt a problem, that is even more, essential. And so they went into all of that. They went into leadership. They got the women into very, very critical sort of, into the local bodies and into the governance, made them very critical agents of, what we call decision-making process. They actually, in many ways, all of this came together and compelled a lot of changes, even in men. In fact, at some levels, the men even became pragmatic and said, okay, if this is the way it has to happen, we are okay with it, as long as, we are all sort of, our own lives are getting better. But that is at one level. But at another level, a lot of problem solving around each of this began. and women became agents of what we call, this is where the seeds of transformative change was established. And I think that's the key lesson we need to learn. Every time we make a little sort of, progress, we really need to understand as to two things we need to understand in that progress. Have we left anything have we done any harm in the process of making progress? That's something that we need to question. We often, push these issues under the carpet because we don't want to sort of engage with very complex issues, but we need to. In fact, we need to anticipate all the harm before we do any work and constantly check whether we are, circumventing all that harm. That's one thing we need to check. The second thing we need to check for whatever we do is whether it is really reflecting the most marginalized or the most excluded. And not to use not to sort of, underestimate what you're doing, but not to overestimate it, to constantly be in the know on what is not happening as much as what is happening, and also to constantly track that do no harm. And this is what this entire process tells you, that, we know that one fallout of all of this, economic empowerment is also a different kind of indebtedness and stress. And the pandemic actually exposed the fragility of what we were doing, and it became very clear that any sort of livelihood program that does not center stage this whole issue of gender equality, that does not understand or does not cope with these sort of, shall we say, the structural dimensions of women's, shall we say, backwardness or lack of progress or whatever, being left behind, whatever word we use, the subordination of women, if we don't, deal with that, we are, going to create what are called, shall we say, bouquet solutions. You have a sort of some kind of, showpiece of something happening, but it really has not impacted the communities, nor has it impacted the system. It's just being celebrated for some, very important breakthroughs, but not the kind that we are looking at. So gender equality has to be very critical. And the third element, which they already had set up, but it took a far more, nuanced form. They'd already set up these 3-tier structures at the village level, at the ward level, and at the panchayat level. And these were sort of, like a federation. From one level, neighborhood groups go up to 3 lakhs. Your area development societies are around 20,000. And your CDS, which is like a system, and has representation from both the community and the system, is the local self-government, is sort of, around over a little over 1,000 entities are there. These are the formal entities. This was already there, but around these, 3-tier, they started working on the excluded groups, and that is what is important. They created special groups for women in sex work. They would not come into the self-help groups. They'll be treated differently. The transgenders were not being accepted. They would be treated differently. Single women, widows were all, struggling with their own, lack of psychosocial support and the environment. They started tackling each of these issues. They brought the entire organizational structure, which is actually something that, Kerala has been working on, what they call the Gram Panchayat Development Plan. It actually, Kudumbashree, when it started in 98, it came out of what is called a people's plan, which was, sort of unleashed or catalyzed in 96. And by 98, all of this came into being. But now, with much more, shall we say, intentional gender policy, gender, mainstreaming and transformative, they started working on the panchayat level plans. And you can see that they went out of the way to prioritize for the most excluded. And this is the kind of thing that you have to start. These are the narratives that you have to unfold as you're talking about livelihood. And of course, all the social entitlements they went into, they also created what is called a systemic process, strengthened the systemic process. They've always been very strong. It's not like they had to, break the barriers. Some bits of the barriers had been broken, but it was not yielding the dividend. So they went about, streamlining the organizational structures. And at the stage that we were studying, we were assessing them, they were now moving to the level of, gender, setting up proper institutional mechanisms of gender resource centers, bringing all the three elements that we are talking about together and setting it up at every level. Already the process of training is relentless. Multiple trainings are going on at all levels. There is an intention to make every, member and the core of the cadre completely infused with what we call gender perspective and gender lens. There are, they've set up their own what we call anchor points everywhere called the gender resource person. They're constantly involved in what we call vulnerability mapping and strengthening the women's component plan. And of course, addressing issues of violence. So you can see that, if you look at the 5 things, whether it is the structural issues of violence, whether it is the entire shall we say, understanding of the vulnerabilities and what really stood out, what stood the test of time is the way they responded to the flood of 2022. Kerala was inundated. We had some horrific pictures on the television when the floods were happening. And it was this very set of, program leaders that stepped in and worked on what is called and not just a relief, not just a rescue relief operations, but on a long-term basis of, forging the communities back into what they were doing. A whole set of rehabilitation was done. And, they were actually lauded like the ASHA workers of the COVID. They were lauded as the local warriors that, helped the entire state and the system and the people to, withstand that huge, natural or both natural and man-made disaster that they witnessed. So I think the key lessons that, just to conclude, the key lessons that emerges, gender equality is very much integral to all the, issues that we work on. In fact, I'll just conclude with one small narration of our own project. When we went into Kolkata and worked on a social inclusion project, post, COVID, we were forced to, like many other cities, to look at the entire issue of livelihood. And then when we looked at that livelihood, we had ensured, prior to that, we had ensured a very concerted, what is called a social development or a gender responsive social development intervention across the community. And from there, we, took off on the livelihood program. And the livelihood program spawned within a short period of 3 months with a consortium of partners, both private players, CSOs, government, banks, and of course the entire, employment portal, all put together came because the women were so ready, the leadership was so ready, and all kinds of agencies walked in to, support the women in skilling, in placement, in credit, and in, transforming their lives. It became very clear that, something that we had not intended to do, very accidentally we went into somewhere, the whole thing fell into place for us. And when I read, or when I was assessing and I was comparing the experience of Kutumbashree with that, I realized that, and we went back in a retrospect. I can share that paper with you and try to trace how the entire thing unraveled. And we found that, because we had taken some early steps on gender equality, we have taken some great steps on gender responsive social development, our livelihood program just, exponentially grew within a short period of time. That's it, Meenakshi.
Thank you so much, Akhilaji. I think it was a very thought-provoking presentation. And I definitely have few of my colleagues who would be interested in asking questions. I can read one of the question has come from Shubhangi, and she's a colleague at Access. And I think you spoke about, when you were talking of the Kutumbashree experience, you spoke about these critical agents of change and critical agents of change for decision-making process. And Shubhangi has typed out a question where she's made a point. It's not so much like a question, but it's a point that she's making that, when you talk of these critical agents, even, the ones amongst women who hold the power, sometimes they don't even raise their voice for the more marginalized ones. And they get into enjoying the power so much that they actually forget for which cause have they come up. And so her question is that how do you make sure that the most vulnerable and the marginalized also get a chance to come forward and, they don't sort of get a chance to kind of, be heard and recognized and seen. I hope, Shubhangi, is that what you wanted to ask? And if you want to add on, please feel free to do that. Shubhangi, are you there? And she's saying yes. And how do we ensure that they too become critical agents?
Which is why I said, what is fascinating is that, it's not like they're keeping quiet. All the groups are, in fact, the caste groups are also, revolting against the leadership. And that's when they started creating the subgroups. They started creating the sub-plans and, ensuring that it's not just women-led, but within women, there are, stratifications, and there is a conscious attempt. When we go into the community, one of the things that we do, whatever mechanism we set up many mechanisms for water and sanitation and hygiene. We set up something called community management committees, because water, sanitation, and hygiene is like housekeeping. You have to cook every day and wash and mop and then eat and then cook again. So water, sanitation, hygiene it's like a 24/7 job, and you need management and you need leadership that, is able to harness everybody's involvement. But when we look at something like livelihood and social inclusion, we have created a mechanism called help desks. Within the help desk, what we do is, depending on the composition of the community, sometimes in a whole sort of slum or in a particular area, it'll be full of, let's say, construction workers, or it'll be full of, sanitation workers, or there'll be a mix of, sanitation workers, daily wage workers. Depending on that composition, the representation is given to the help desk. So that particular representative represents their constituency. And often the help desk is portable. It doesn't work just at where they are living. It goes to the workplace, because that's the nature of that community. For instance, in Rajasthan, we have this community called Sansi, a denotified and very vilified, community, vilified by the British. And they continue to sort of reel under the stigma. And in fact, it's so bad, the situation, that they, persist in practicing some of the, behavior that they're not supposed to. But they've never been given a chance to come out of it. Now that entire community ran a help desk because it's a congregation. The entire settlement is them, and the change that they have wrought is unbelievable. In what has happened over there. So this is another way of ensuring that you not only build collective leadership, but you also build representative leadership. You don't just get 10 smart talkers to lead that, show. They'll take you for a ride because they don't care about who you are. But if you have it as representative, then they go back to their constituency, and many of them, are burning with the desire to make the difference. They are at that level, at that cusp. They haven't reached that stage of, feeling powerful and complacent. The challenges are too many in front of them. And that's how you bring in the change. And of course, you constantly rotate that leadership. Both principles, representation and rotation. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was really helpful.
These are things that you can come and see too. Even on any of you wish to come and see in any cities that we are in, please come and see. And you can even see it virtually. If you want to, spend the afternoon talking to them, you can.
Sure, thank you so much. Is there anybody else? कोई और है जो हमारे state offices में जो हमारी teams हैं, कोई question करना चाहता है? अखिला जी से कोई सवाल है आपका? Please feel free to raise any question or concerns, or if you want to make any point based on the work that you are doing on ground. So, Akhila ji, I think, I mean, by and large, the presentation that you made today is extremely useful. And I'm sure we will be able to apply some of these learnings into our ongoing projects and programs. And thank you so much for joining in.
Any feedback they want to give them later after a little bit of thinking and reflection.
I think there is too much to kind of, absorb. And I'm sure they will definitely take time out to reflect on what have they learned today. And we definitely look forward to having you again whenever, you are prepared and you are available. I deeply appreciate that, I know that you've not been keeping well, but the commitment to the cause is so much that, I'm so grateful to you that you could take time out to join us today. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Deeply appreciate your presence. Thank you so much. On behalf of Access.
Thanks to everyone for patient listening. Thank you.
Thank you. As always, you were very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.
Vikram.